An old farmer lived a life measured by the rising sun and the slow turning of the seasons. For 40 years, he had worked the same patch of earth, a solitary man against a backdrop of silent, imposing mountains and a forest that seemed to drink the light. He found a creature in his barn one night, a thing of myth and shadow, but the real reason it was there was not what he, or anyone, could have ever expected. It was a truth born not of terror, but of a quiet, soul-shattering grief. His name was Elias. He was a man whose words had grown sparse over the years, used only when necessary, like a tool worn smooth with age. His wife was a memory, a faded photograph on the mantelpiece, and his children were distant voices on a telephone line. His world had contracted to the boundaries of his fence posts, to the familiar weight of a pail of milk and the rhythmic crackle of the wood stove in the evenings. The silence of his life was a constant companion, a heavy blanket he had long ago learned to accept. The farm was his anchor. It was a place of predictable cycles. The rooster crowed. The sun climbed over the eastern ridge. He mended what was broken, tended to what was living, and rested when the work was done. His hands were calloused and his back ached, but there was a simple honesty in the labor. It left no room for the deeper loneliness that sometimes crept in at the edges of the day, when the shadows grew long and the house felt cavernously empty. But in recent weeks, the familiar silence of the wilderness had changed. It had acquired a new voice, a sound that did not belong. It was a deep, resonant cry that drifted from the forest on moonless nights, a sound that made the cattle restless in their stalls. He told himself it was a bear, or perhaps a moose, but the explanation felt thin. It felt insufficient. The sound carried a weight of sorrow that animals, he thought, did not possess. Other signs appeared, small disturbances in his orderly world. A thick branch on an old oak, too high for any deer, was snapped clean in two. A footprint, impossibly large and vaguely human, was pressed deep into the mud by the creek bed, a print he quickly smoothed over with his boot. He dismissed these things. He chose to ignore them. It was easier to live in a world he understood. He started to feel a presence at the edge of his vision. When he worked the fields bordering the woods, he felt the prickle of eyes upon his back. He would turn, scanning the dense wall of pine and fir, but see nothing. There was only the whisper of the wind through the needles, the chattering of a squirrel. Yet, the feeling remained. He was not alone. The forest was watching him. One night, the sound was different. It was closer. It was not the mournful, distant call he had grown accustomed to. This was a sound of acute distress, a series of low, guttural sobs that seemed to tear from a tormented chest. And it was coming from the barn. The old barn stood apart from the house, a skeletal silhouette against the starry sky. He had not used it for years. It was a place of dust, forgotten tools, and the ghosts of harvests past. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. No bear would venture so close, so boldly. This was something else. He pulled his old shotgun from its hooks above the door. The weapon was heavy and cold in his hands, a comfort he did not fully trust. He lit a kerosene lantern, its golden light pushing back the oppressive darkness, making the shadows dance and writhe. Each step he took across the yard was deliberate, loud in the profound quiet of the night. The crying from the barn had subsided into a low, continuous rumble, a sound of pure misery. The massive wooden door of the barn groaned as he slid it open just enough to slip inside. The air was thick with the smell of old hay, damp earth, and something else. Something wild and musky. He raised the lantern, its light cutting a trembling swath through the gloom. And then he saw it. In the farthest corner, huddled in the deepest shadows, was a creature of impossible scale. It was immense, a mountain of dark, matted fur, its broad shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. It was not a bear. Its form was too humanoid, its limbs too long, its shape too familiar and yet terrifyingly alien. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The stories, the whispers, the legends he had heard all his life. They were true. He lifted the shotgun, his hands shaking. The creature did not react. It did not snarl or rise to its full, intimidating height. It remained curled on the hay-strewn floor, rocking back and forth with a slow, rhythmic agony. Its head was bowed, and from it came that low, heartbreaking rumble. He took a hesitant step forward, the lantern light spilling further into the corner. That was when he saw the reason for its sorrow. Lying on a bed of carefully arranged hay beside the massive figure was a smaller form. It was a child, a perfect, miniature version of the larger creature, its fur a lighter shade of brown. It was unnaturally still. Its eyes were closed. It was not breathing. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was not a monster. This was a mother. She had come to his barn not for shelter from the elements, but to find a quiet place to grieve. The enormous, mythical beast of folklore was mourning her dead child. His fear dissolved, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. He saw not a threat, but a reflection of a pain he knew all too well. He remembered standing over a small, polished casket many years ago, the silence in that room as profound and devastating as the silence in this barn. The shotgun suddenly felt obscene in his hands, an instrument of ignorant violence in the face of such a sacred sorrow. He slowly, carefully, lowered the weapon. He leaned it against the barn wall, the clink of metal against wood echoing in the stillness. The creature's head lifted slightly at the sound. Two large, dark eyes, full of an intelligence and a sadness that startled him, met his. There was no malice in them, only a bottomless well of pain. He raised his empty hands, a gesture he hoped she would understand. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off her. He slid the heavy door closed, leaving it open just a crack, and retreated to the warmth of his house. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the sheer, stunning weight of what he had just witnessed. He did not sleep. He sat in his kitchen, the shotgun now resting forgotten in a corner. He thought of the grieving mother in his barn. He could not leave her alone in her misery. He filled a clean bucket with fresh water from the pump. He took the thickest, warmest wool blanket he owned from a chest at the foot of his bed. He also gathered a few apples from a bowl on his table. He returned to the barn, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not carry the lantern this time, letting his eyes adjust to the faint starlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. He pushed the door open wider and placed the bucket, the blanket, and the apples just inside the threshold, well away from her corner. He spoke, his voice a quiet whisper that the vast, dark space seemed to swallow. "It's for you." He did not know if she understood the words, but he hoped she understood the intent. He retreated once more, leaving her to her vigil. A silent pact formed over the next few days. Each morning, he would find the bucket empty and the apples gone. He would refill the water and leave more food, carrots from his garden, a loaf of bread, a handful of nuts. He never tried to enter the barn fully. He would leave his offerings at the entrance and then retreat to his porch, where he would sit for hours, simply keeping watch. He felt like a guardian of her grief. He could feel her presence from across the yard. It was a heavy, palpable thing, a dense pocket of sorrow that had settled over his farm. He did not hear her cry again, but he felt her stillness. He imagined her sitting in the dark, cradling the small, lifeless body, unwilling to let go. On the third evening, as dusk settled over the valley, he brought her food as usual. As he knelt to place the bowl of vegetables on the ground, a shadow fell over him. He looked up. She was standing in the doorway, blocking out the last of the fading light. She was immense, taller than he could have imagined, her sheer bulk filling the entire frame of the entrance. He was trapped. His blood ran cold. He had misjudged. He had been a fool. This was a wild animal, and he had cornered it. But she did not move toward him. She simply stood there, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. Then, with a slowness that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a huge, long-fingered hand reached out from the shadows. It did not lash out. It did not grab. It moved with a quiet purpose and gently, almost delicately, closed around his wrist. His heart seized in his chest. The grip was not painful. It was firm, but not crushing. Her skin was tough and leathery, like ancient bark. He could feel the immense power coiled in her arm, a strength that could snap him in two without effort. This was a test. She was gauging him, reading his intent in the frantic pulse of his own blood. He forced himself to be still. He did not pull away. He did not scream. He simply knelt there, his wrist encircled by the hand of a living legend, and met her gaze. He let all the fear drain out of him, leaving only the quiet empathy that had drawn him here in the first place. He held her gaze, trying to project a simple message, I will not hurt you. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, as gently as it had closed, her hand opened. She withdrew her arm back into the shadows of the barn. She had tested him, and he had, in some way he did not understand, passed. She shifted slightly, allowing a sliver of twilight to fall upon her. He saw her face clearly for the first time. It was not the face of a monster. It was weathered and creased, framed by shaggy, dark fur. Her deep-set eyes held a profound wisdom, a deep-seated weariness. She then turned her head and nudged the small, still form at her feet with her nose. It was an invitation. She was showing him her wound, sharing the source of her pain. She trusted him. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows of his small house. Thunder cracked across the sky, shaking the very foundations of the world. All he could think about was the mother in the drafty old barn. He pulled on his coat and went outside, leaning into the wind. He found her standing at the barn's entrance, a great silhouette against the flashes of lightning. She was looking out at the storm, then toward the dark wall of the forest. The small body of her child was now carefully, lovingly wrapped in the wool blanket he had given her. She was holding it like a precious, fragile gift. She saw him approach. She turned her massive head, her eyes catching the dim light from his house. He understood. The time for grieving in this borrowed shelter was over. It was time to take her child home, to return it to the wild earth from which it came. She took a step toward him. He stood his ground, his heart aching for her. She reached out her hand again. This time, she did not take his wrist. She placed her huge, warm palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. He could feel a low vibration emanate from her, a deep, resonant rumble that passed from her body into his. It was not a sound of warning. It was a sound of gratitude, of shared understanding. In that single, silent moment, two worlds touched. A solitary man and a creature of myth, bound together by the universal language of loss. She held her hand there for a long moment, then withdrew. She looked down at the ground, picked up a single, smooth white stone, worn by water and time, and gently placed it into his open palm. A token, a gift, a memory made solid. Then, she turned away. With an impossible grace for a creature so large, she bent down and scooped up her blanket-wrapped child in her powerful arms. She cradled it to her chest and began to walk, not away from him, but past him, toward the edge of the field where the forest began. She moved silently, her heavy footfalls making no sound on the rain-soaked ground. At the tree-line, where the ordered rows of his farm met the untamed chaos of the wilderness, she paused. She turned her head one last time and looked back at him. Across the windswept darkness, their eyes met in a final, meaningful glance. It was a look of farewell, of respect, of a shared secret that would forever bind them. And then, she stepped into the forest and was gone. She did not fade or recede. She simply vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the ancient woods, leaving him alone in the storm. The silence that returned to the farm was different now. It was heavier, deeper. The world felt both larger and emptier. The barn, once a place of forgotten things, now felt like a hollowed-out sanctuary, sacred and empty. His solitude was no longer a simple fact of his life. It was a vessel holding an impossible memory. He stood in the rain for a long time, the smooth, white stone growing warm in his hand. He looked at the forest, but it had reclaimed its secrets. It was once again just a wall of dark trees. But he knew better. He knew that it held wonders and sorrows beyond human comprehension. He had looked into the eyes of that world, and it had looked back. He knew he could never speak of this. To tell anyone would be a betrayal. They would not see a grieving mother. They would see a prize, a monster, a scientific curiosity. They would hunt her, trap her, and put her sorrow on display. He would not allow that. He would protect her, and her child, in the only way he could, with his silence. The secret became a part of him, a quiet weight in his soul. He returned to his routines, to the milking and the mending, but nothing was ever the same. The forest was no longer a border to his property. It was a living, breathing entity, a neighbor he respected. The strange sounds at night no longer startled him. He would simply nod, a quiet acknowledgement to a world he now knew existed alongside his own. He lived out the rest of his years on that small farm, a solitary man with a profound secret. The white stone sat on his windowsill, a constant reminder of the shocking, heartbreaking truth he had found in his barn. It was a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, one can find not a monster to be feared, but a heart that breaks, just like our own.